Shalom to all. It's my personal pleasure to greet you all and welcome you to this auspicious scholarly gathering, honoring my colleague and my friend and our mutual friend, Professor Cana Werman, on her retirement from teaching. I underline from teaching because she's not retiring. As she embarks on the real journey of research, the afterlife of academia, retirement. As a scholar of the Second Temple period in Jewish history and the deep-rooted conversations over the exact nature of the afterlife, the Eschatan and the Olam Haba, and her own personal field of expertise. So I guess it is up to her to chart her own path of the academic afterlife. I've had the privilege of serving alongside and under Cana, both as a colleague and as she was also chair of my department in the Department of Jewish History here at Ben-Gurion University, but I've known her and followed her work long before we became colleagues in the same department and fellows here at the Center for the Study of Conversion and Interreligious Encounters. That is the essence of, in essence, this is the Center for the Study of Religion here at Ben-Gurion University. I first knew Cana from afar when I began my own research on my PhD back in the late 90s, when we were both frequent flyers, as you may call us, in the old building of the National Library in Givat. Back then, Cana was working on what eventually became her groundbreaking edition of the Book of Jubilee, Sefer HaYovlim. She always sat in the back rows of the Islamic and the Oriental section of the reading room. Probably, I'm speculating, but you can decide whether it's true or not, probably due to the proximity of so many dictionaries of Semitic languages like Gez, she used frequently in her work. She was one of the first ones to arrive and one of those that would sit and work tirelessly all day with very few talk and coffee breaks. I should mention that. Trained in the kibbutz tradition of diligence and hard work. And for me and for other young scholars at the time, we would watch her in awe and envy and look at her dedication to this labor of love she was pursuing, carefully preparing what would eventually become the award-winning Yad Ben Tzvi edition of Jubilees, that since its publication became a cornerstone to all those scholars working on Second Temple Jewish philosophy, history of ideas, as well as scholars of early Christianity. Cana earned her PhD from the Hebrew University after writing a dissertation about the different attitudes towards Gentiles in the Book of Jubilees, the writings of Qumran, and the early teachings of what would eventually become rabbinic tradition, under the late Professor Shmuel Safrai. During her career here at BGU, she was the chair of the Deichmann Center for the Study of Christianity, a senior fellow and part of the steering committee here at CSOC, and the chair of the Department of Jewish History. She was constantly praised by students for her teaching abilities, addressing the most complex and at times obscure issues with outstanding clarity and transparency. I want to thank you all for coming and for joining us in celebrating and honoring our friend and towering scholar. And judging by the esteemed lineup of speakers and the topics they gave to their presentations, we are in for a very high-end intellectual experience this afternoon. So thank you all for joining us, and I hand it over to my colleague, Daniella. Please.
Thanks, Effie. Effie spoke as a friend and as the chair of the Department of Jewish History at Ben-Gurion. And I will also speak as a friend and as the ex-chair of the Center for the Study of Conversion and Interreligious Encounters, which now Professor Oded Israeli chairs. But this event, as some of you know, was supposed to take place last year when I still was chair. So I will fulfill my obligation with pleasure at this timing. Let me stress that the event is the joint effort of the center and of the Department of Jewish Studies, and I thank for the collaboration. So although I very much resent the idea of your retirement, Cana, for selfish reasons, as I will soon explain, and for the common good, I'm very happy that this celebration of the occasion finally takes place. Most of you may remember that it was scheduled for June 17th, 2025, which turned out to be somewhere in the middle of the 12th Day War, known in Hebrew as Am Kelavi. We hope it won't repeat now. And although Professor Roland Deines and his wife were undeterred and arrived in Israel as planned, the windows of our center were shattered by an Iranian missile, and the campus was off limits for a couple of weeks. We substituted the colloquium for casual coffee at my place. Having heard of Ronald's commitment to Israel and his friendship with Cana during that coffee, I'm not surprised, but nonetheless very thankful that you made the trip yet again. I also thank Professor Rina Talgam and Professor Adiel Schremer for agreeing immediately to reschedule their lectures and for coming today. Thank you, Nirit, our tireless dean, for being always present at such important events. And thanks also to Raya, where are you? Yes, for organizing everything perfectly. Right. Yes. Effie has eloquently expressed some of my thoughts for the occasion, but I will add a few brief comments of my own nonetheless. My acquaintance with Cana goes back to 2000, a year we both spent in Princeton, mainly at the Parson Library, while our young daughters went together to the same elementary school and after school. I was a little lost and quite lonely during the first month, but hardly dared to suggest coffee or lunch breaks. Cana was too preoccupied with her work. She concentrated so intensely from 9 till 6 p.m. that one winter afternoon, schools announced an early shutdown due to snow. Believe it or not, it happens in Princeton too. Cana didn't budge while I rushed to take the girls out of school in panic. Later, we both joined the BGU faculty and often traveled together from Jerusalem to Be'er-Sheva and back. I very much miss those rides, not only because more often than not, Cana was the driver and always insisted on dropping me just by my house, mainly because of our conversations. I had the pleasure of listening to Cana's sharp criticism of quite a few scholars of the Second Temple period and early Christianity, sometimes through enthusiastic admiration and generous appraisal of others, rarely something in between. I learned a great deal. Being a keen listener, Cana also listened to me lecturing about my research and teaching. And she, as we heard, is still a dedicated teacher who really cares for her students. Cana gave me plenty of insights, especially but not only on Jewish issues and on themes that interest both of us, such as historiography and collective memory, and important good advice pertaining to the management of the center. Thanks for all that, Cana, and for the gossip and frequent updates on family matters. And many thanks for being such a devoted, conscientious, and reliable member of the steering committee of the center, taking such an active part in so many seminars and conferences and field trips, including the trip to Oxford, well-remembered trip to Oxford. Your presence really made a difference, and we all
really hearing the wonderful lectures that we are about to hear and honoring such a good colleague. Yeah, I'm staying. I'm not going anywhere. No budget, no, nothing boring. I'm staying here. But I will be very brief, of course, but I wanted to really to comment that this is a great pleasure and a true honor to welcome all of you here. Thank you so much for coming. And we are holding this colloquium in honor, in celebration of the retirement of Professor Cana Werman, and I joined Effie only from teaching at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. I would like to extend our warmest thanks to the Department of Jewish History, to Effie, first of all, and to the Center for the Study of Conversion and Interreligious Encounters. It's doing exciting work, to Daniella and to Oded, and of course to Raya for their exceptional work, for initiating and organizing this meaningful event. This gathering reflects not only academic excellence, but also deep appreciation for a scholar whose work, teaching, and presence have left a lasting mark on our department, our faculty, our university, and the wider scholarly community. We are especially pleased to welcome our distinguished guest, as said, from the Hebrew University, from Germany. Thank you so much for coming. And of course, also from Bar-Ilan, of course, from Bar-Ilan as well. Your willingness to take part in this colloquium is a powerful testament to the respect and admiration that Cana enjoys. And we are very grateful for your being with us today. This occasion gives us an opportunity not only to honor Cana personally, but also to reflect more broadly on the importance of history as a discipline, and in particular on the study of Jewish history, a field to which she has devoted her life's work. Jewish history is far more than a chronological account of past events. It is a history deeply rooted in text, interpretation, and debates, a history shaped by law, theology, ritual, and lived experience. To study Jewish history is to engage with questions of identity, continuity, and change, questions that remain profoundly relevant in each and every generation, and in our day as well. The periods that stand at the center of Cana's scholarship, the Second Temple period, early rabbinic Judaism, and the formative stages of Christianity are among the most complex and exciting chapters in Jewish history. There are periods marked by diversity, creativity, and tension in which religious ideas, legal norms, and communal boundaries were being shaped in dynamic and often contested ways. Studying this area requires not only broad historical vision, but also exceptional methodological rigor. Here, the philological historical method plays a crucial role. Careful attention to language, textual transmission, variant tradition, and historical context is the foundation of responsible historical research. Philology, in this sense, is not merely a technical skill, it is an intellectual discipline that trains us to listen closely to our sources, to respect the complexity. And Professor Cana scholarship stands as a model of this approach. Her work demonstrates how precise, patient engagement with ancient texts across Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and much more can illuminate broad historical processes. Through philological rigor combined with historical insight, she has shown how ideas develop, how traditions interact, and how legal and theological concepts take shape over time. And this is perhaps most powerfully embodied in her monumental work on the Book of Jubilee, a critical edition, and I am a big fan of critical edition. Till today, I see the importance of what you have done. And in fact, this is the result of many, many years of dedicated research, and it represents a landmark achievement in the field, an open new possibility. Beyond this major contribution, research spans a remarkable range of topics, and we shall hear more about it today. Equally important, and then I turned to the other hat, the dean is Professor Werman. Cana's role as a teacher and mentor. Over the years, she has guided countless students with clarity, integrity, and generosity. Her teaching has been marked by intellectual dedication, methodological discipline, and deep respect for historical sources and for the students. Within the department in the university and within the center especially, Cana has been a valued colleague, thoughtful principal, and deeply committed to academic life. And she's one of those people that when you ask somebody, she is always willing to help and take. She's the one you can count on, one of the ones you can count on, and I'm deeply grateful. This is an aspect I've learned in my term as dean. Today, Cana, we celebrate your achievements, but we also express our gratitude. We thank you for years of devoted service, for your scholarship that has expanded our understanding of Jewish history, and for your dedication to the Institute and to the faculty, and your lasting influence on generation of students. And again, although this marks a retirement from formal teaching, your work will continue to inspire, to challenge, and to guide us. And I wish you, and we wish you, many years of continued creativity, intellectual engagement, and we look forward to the new chapters that still lie ahead. So thank you for everything, Cana, and thank you everybody for coming.
So it's a great pleasure for me to be here. And after I heard these introductory notes, I'm greatly honored that I had already 2 coffees this morning with Cana. So obviously this is very exceptional that she takes so much time for colleagues and friends. So I'm greatly honored that we spent the night together, so to speak. So we had dinner last night, and this morning we made a kind of remembrance tour on our places in Beersheba, and this is how I wanted actually to start. That I know, Cana. Yeah, of course it's you. In front of a Roman milestone on the not far away from Ben-Gurion. We came together here at the Ben-Gurion University through the Deichmann lecture. So you see Larry Hurtado, that was the beginning of the Deichmann lectures in 2004. And 2016 then was the last of these Deichmann lectures. And I simply wanted to, you see, I'm a Mac person. I struggle always with non-Macs. Okay, so I simply wanted to remember him and some people related to this program as well, because otherwise I think Cana would not be the scholar she is and would not have the opportunity to really develop her skills in this way and get her place here in Beersheba. So I think remembrance of him is in place, and we walked the campus this morning looking at the Deichmann building for mathematics, which was one of the early ones, and then for computer science and the Deichmann Plaza, where we had breakfast from Aroma. So this is what brought us here. And you see, that was the usual setting in which building it was. So the Zipi and the others who made in the Mikra department. And I think this is a very touching picture, because this is a way how Deichmann approached people, in the sense of interested in their stories and trying to reach out for people. And I think it's nice that he has Tova in his arms here. Part of the Deichmann program was always the meetings in the family home of Tal Shears in Metar. And there was Dodik and their son, I've forgotten his name, which is a Lotan, yes. So that was always part of my Beersheba experience. And so I just wanted to start with this, because what do you deduce from the previous pictures to turn now to the lecture? So first of all, family matters, and perhaps family matters in Israel even more than in other places. And this is one of the things I learned from Cana, but even more from Zipi and Dodik. But just this morning on our ride through Beersheba, Cana said the sentence, "You can't raise children in Israel without family." And I think this is an experience which is not just a contemporary experience, but experience which goes down through centuries, actually. And I think I have never experienced people who are so closely related to families and their relationships with family than I experienced here in Israel. So I think this is gave me something to think about family. And then I started to do more research on the family of Jesus, because in Christian tradition, Jesus is a kind of lonely hero. And the family, of course, plays a little bit a role, Virgin Mary, but saying Virgin Mary is the opposite of a family woman. So Jesus is not regarded as a family person, and so that was what kindled my interest. And when you go to Jerusalem, you see the picture on the side. This is the inside the Armenian Cathedral of James, and actually within the Armenian Cathedral, there the head of his brother is venerated. So they think it's buried there, and the rest of his body is in Santiago de Compostela, because in some miraculous way he made his way to Spain. We don't bother about this, but at least James, the brother of Jesus and the leader of the Jerusalem congregation, which was somehow founded by his brother from the 40s of the first century till 62, shows that family relations obviously mattered as well for Jesus and his impact. No, I didn't want to show it. So, and forgive me, I prepared a long lecture with 20 pages, very scholarly, and last night I reworked it, which you see, this is now handwritten notes, because I thought there's something more to say about this topic. So I want to start with a kind of personal observation of the scholarly craft and of the way how Cana and I work together in these years. So you can call it Cana and Hillel on the one side, and Deines and or Roland and James or Jesus on the other side. You can call it minimalists or maximalists. So it was just mentioned the philological care of Cana. So that's one part of the historical craft, but I'm more leaning on the kind of historical fantasy. So I'm more on the maximalist side. So Cana is great in deconstructing established ideas. I'm more interested in embellishing and trying to imagine how life was. And so very simplistic. It's skepticism against naivety or historical optimism. And last but not least, also the question about divine agency in the workings of our world, past and present, something I'm eager to involve in the historical discussion, because I think we should not leave the question of the divine out of the scholarly thinking. But this was a constant discussion with Zippy and with Cana, because they insist that the scholarly craft should not involve the agency of any divine entities. But this is, so our debate, and Cana has a wonderful way to express her disdain. Whenever I suggested something she found odd, she made a certain wah sound. And that's something which rings in my ear whenever I sit at my desk and make some outrageous claim about things might have been, because there is some evidence, and I put the evidence together into a story, into a picture, and create something whole. And then I hear, wow. Because, okay, where are the details? Where are the texts? Where are the evidence for this? And of course, there's not always enough evidence, but I would say we have only, let's say, less than 1% in writing what life means in actuality. So we have to imagine things, and you have to fill the gaps. And I see myself more on this side. So, but with her criticism or with her scholarship, she is always a kind of sounding board in my mind, even if she's not there. And I think this is a good way of scholarly interaction. We need the critical minds who deconstruct our sources, holy or not, and who insist on evidence. I call them in my teaching on the history of New Testament scholarship the destroyers. But I always make clear that destroyers have an important function because they tear down established cathedrals of knowledge. And in doing so, they provide a necessary service for the traditionalists, meaning these who held the text and their traditional construction of history based on them in high regard. In Christian scholarship, these type of scholars are labeled those who held a high view of scripture. They are never the revolutionary type, but they are the rebuilder. After the destroyers have done their work, after often accompanied by public acclaim or at least attention, these rebuilders are rarely the famous scholars, but they rebuild or partly reconstruct the traditional view in a modified and often strengthened way than it was before. So when I studied in the 1980s and 90s, the image of Jesus was, we know nothing at all about Jesus. So this was the post-Bultmann era for those who are know a little bit about New Testament scholarship. So Bultmann and his demythologizing program taught down every solid knowledge about Jesus. And there was nothing left, 5 or 6 sentences which might go back to Jesus, that was all. And then came the so-called third quest of the historical Jesus, which put Jesus in his Jewish context. And now, 50 years later, most scholars, the more liberal or skeptical, as the more conservative would say, we know much more about Jesus than we thought we know about him in the 1970s. And this is mainly the work of the rebuilder. So there's not the famous names in the last 50 years, but they put one brickstone on the other, and the cathedral or the building, the synagogue perhaps, is better built now. We have now, because Jewish scholarship on Jesus became boring, a new trend. Now we have again a strong trend, the New Testament and philosophical tradition, Greek tradition. So it's always going back and forth in scholarship. So we had now 50 years Jesus or the New Testament within Judaism. Every topic has 5 PhDs, so you need something new. Now we do Stoa and Philo and Platonism in the New Testament, which I think is a waste of time. But anyhow, it provides scholarship and PhDs, and that's necessary. So what does it say about Cana's scholarship and mine? When Cana looks at the tradition about Hillel, she ends with a question whether Hillel ever existed. I quote her, Hillel, who may have lived during the 1st century CE, did not found a school. After careful consideration of the sources, which are indeed complicated, that's the final line. When I look at the life and traditions of Jesus, I end up with a whole Davidic family clan whose most important figure, Jesus of Nazareth, is at the end not the single lonely hero, but a man within a family heritage, and a family theology who was taught and forged by members of his family through the centuries. So suddenly Jesus has a kind of prehistory, and if we would have a big time, that would be then the main topic of this lecture. Do I have any proof? Somebody need to... So what is... Oh, wonderful. Do I have any proof for this in the strict sense of the word? No. But it is a plausible narrative which is able to integrate the often isolated puzzle pieces of the tradition. And for me, what makes sense and explains the evidence we have might, in the end, give us a clue how things have happened. So for me, the storytelling in history is the decisive part. You need to end up with a story, with a convincing story about how things could have happened. And then, of course, we need to discuss, and it must be built on evidence, but I need this kind of imagination. And I think this is Tzippi Tal-Shir's lasting legacy on my way of looking at Jewish sources and Jewish history, although she belongs to the philological camps very strongly. But it's the experience which I had with her family, which made me think differently. The Jewish history is to a large degree family history, family matters, family forms, family shapes, and occasionally also restricts and contradicts, but it's always the setting of a family is important. And perhaps the harsh words we have in the New Testament against family, especially in the legacy of Jesus, who was clearly not a family man, but made very harsh comments about his family, is only possible if you are tied in very closely within a family, because you have to react and you have to find your own way. And by, let's say, scholarly sources, that the conflict between Jesus and his family is precisely because the family had a clear understanding of their messianic task and the messianic ideas of one of the kinds of their own family should be the Messiah. And the Messiah has a certain task, and Jesus did not fulfill what the family expected from him to do. So he was not the kind of family predicted type of Messiah, and this is why during his lifetime the conflicts were high. And that family matters. Oh no, this is now where so one of my basic assumptions is just mention this. You don't. We can't discuss this here. That the New Testament should be not read as a historical source as the New Testament, because the New Testament has always this label of the Christian Bible. But initially, the individual writings of the New Testament, the Gospel of Matthew, the letters of Paul, and so on, are the writings of Jews from the first century about a Jewish topic, essential Jewish topic, and a story that took place in Galilee and Jerusalem about a person who was seen by some as a Messiah. And we know from Josephus and other sources, some people at this time thought they have found the Messiah. So that's not that unusual. And so the New Testament texts are first of all a collection of individual writings of a Jewish messianic sect, not unlike the Qumranites. And the only difference, so to speak, is that the Qumranites had no succession in Jewish history, whereas this odd Davidic clan, the Nazareans, did finally end up as Christians or Christianity. So I don't bother too much about terminology, one of my faults. Okay. Oh, come on. I'm sorry. Yeah. So, as I said, family matters. And what do we know about the family? My starting line is, who would be interested in the promises of the Bible about a Davidic future messianic king? So a person who might be the rescuer, savior, whatever title you give him, that's not important. But it's clear that in the biblical tradition, in the Hebrew Bible, the house of David and the messianic expectations are somehow closely knitted together. And now if family matters, if people think that they belong to the house of David, are family members, then these people are most interested in these kind of traditions, because we all somehow relate to our family traditions. A very odd example, yesterday at the custom, there was a grumpy person who led us through, and he had a long discussion with a couple in front of me, and I was quite worrying because I had not prepared any paperwork to go through. And then I came, and just one sentence, he asked me, what are you doing? Visiting a friend and giving a talk at Ben-Gurion University. Obviously, this opens all doors. But his answer was, oh, your first name is the same name as a brand of my synthesizer, Roland. And so he thought, okay, I must be a nice guy, and I had no problems at all. But this shows family matters. And if we go to family, this makes something. And so my idea is the Messianic tradition, which we find in Jesus, was developed by descendants of the Davidic family. And I don't mind whether they are real descendants, so that you can a DNA test and so on, but they thought they belonged to the Davidic tradition. And so I make the Nazareans, which is the title of Jesus in the New Testament, which is not the person of Nazareth, but it's the one who belongs to those who hope that the Netzer mentioned in Isaiah will be this branch which will bring redemption to Israel. And these Nazareans, I think, are already a pre-Christian kind of established tradition. And it's interesting that in the church father Epiphanius of Salamis in the 5th century, who wrote a lot of nonsense, but he had some odd and interesting ideas about Jewish history, about the Pharisees, about the Jewish sects, and some of these information are true. So he had some knowledge, and he divided the Nazareans. He has a chapter on 7 pre-Christian sects of Judaism, and then he developed the sectarian history later. And in this pre-Christian sects, he has a kind of Nazareans as well. He makes a small distinction, so that would be then the task of the philologist. But when he describes the content, they are very close. They live in the same area. They have very similar traditions. And I think he just wanted to avoid to say that Jesus is not the original Son of God without a biography, but actually somebody who is part of a tradition and brought this tradition then to fruition. Then my time is up. So you see, when you look at messianic figures in the Jewish history, you see there is often a family related to it. They are not individuals. The Hasmoneans have some messianic elements in their tradition, combining priestly and Davidic elements or messianic elements. We have the family of Judas the Galilean, the founder of the Sicarii or Zealots. So you can trace their history through 3 or 4 generations. And Adrongas, one of these people Josephus mentioned, he has 4 brothers whom he employed. So he was not alone in his doing. And if you just, no, this is not the end of the slideshow. Obviously, there was one, the most important, skipped over, namely the whole family of Jesus. Yeah, here. When you look at the text of the New Testament, you see a lot of people who are related to Jesus play an important role. And I think there are many traces within the New Testament that show that Jesus was not the single person, but that he was part of a Davidic messianic clan, which I call the Nazarenes, which is the basic of his understanding. So we have in Jesus not the single Christian hero, but the offspring of a Jewish family who was integral part of the life, at least of Jerusalem, until the destruction in the Bar Kokhba War in 135. Because in early church fathers, we have some hints that descendants of the Jesus family actually had administrative roles and leading roles in the church in Jerusalem until 135. And so Jesus is part of family. That's my main claim. Thank you very much. And thank you that you helped me to understand this decisive part.
Shalom lechulam. Dear Cana, thank you for the kind invitation to speak in this colloquium. It is a great honor for me. I hope you are already enjoying having more time to devote to research and writing, as well as the chance to enjoy all the things you had to set aside because of your many academic commitments. I wish you good health and happiness in this chapter, this new chapter of your life. Archaeology offers an endless stream of fresh insights into the past. Once in a while, the discoveries unearthed in archaeological excavations call into questions our existing paradigms, prompting us to replace the old conceptions with new ones. It is precisely this sort of find that constitutes the kernel of the story that I will tell in our meeting. The tale of a decorated stone that was found by Dina Abshalom Gorni and Arfa Najjar during the excavations of a synagogue dated to the 1st century CE at Magdala on the shore of the Sea of Galilee.
Oh, I'm glad. I'm not the only one.
Okay, בסדר, okay. The archaeological plan of the synagogue accords with what is known about other synagogues from the Second Temple period in Roman Judea. And its 1st century dating is corroborated by the numismatic evidence, the typology of pottery, and the artistic features of both the wall painting and the floor mosaic. Close to the center of the main hall of the synagogue stood an ashlar stone schematically depicting the temple and its utensils. The rich iconography of the stone in the context of a late Second Temple synagogue is unique and contradicts the assumption that the incorporation of temple motifs into synagogue imagery is a transformation of the 3rd century CE that aimed to organize Jewish life in the absence of the temple. This discovery invites a reconsideration of a wide range of subjects relating to Judaism in the Second Temple period. During the 1st century CE and following its early development in the diaspora, the synagogue became a familiar communal and religious institution in Roman Judea. As has been well demonstrated in scholarship, this was a revolutionary structure, whose ritual, unlike that of the temple, did not relate solely to the priestly class. In the synagogue, the entire community participated in the central rite, namely the reading and study of the Torah. Against this background of significant differences, scholars have long pondered the relationship between the two institutions when the temple was still standing. Notable is Donald Binder into the temple courts, the place of the synagogue in the Second Temple period, where they complementary in nature. Alternatively, was the synagogue regarded as an extension of the temple? The placement of a 3-dimensional model of the temple of that time within a synagogue, as was done at Magdala, may turn out to be an important clue regarding the status and function of the synagogue and its link to the temple. Additionally, this decorated stone may shed light on another long-standing puzzle: what has Galilee to do with Jerusalem? I move to the decorative scheme of the Magdala stone. The Magdala stone is a rectangular block with 4 thick legs. It measures 55 centimeters on 67 centimeters and stands 3 centimeters high. Its legs are 7 centimeters high. The 4 upper corners of the Magdala stone exhibit signs of 4 protrusions that were carefully removed without damaging the adjacent reliefs. This protrusion clearly would have lent the stone the appearance of an altar and were accordingly removed. Each of its sides, except for the underside, bears relief decoration. The schematic style of the stone carving shows a preference for symbolic portrayal over real likeness. However, despite their simplicity and the lack of affirmative identification, the objects can be identified as representations of the Jerusalem temple and its cultic vessels. The identification of the motifs depicted on it is based on similar visual depictions from the time of the Second Temple and on literary sources that relate to this temple and its utensils, including the writing of Josephus and Tractat Midot in the Mishnah. Due to time constraints, I will not represent the reasons for identifying all the motifs depicted on the stone. I will suffice by listing them and saying that some of them indicate that the Magdala stone was not intended merely to represent the idea of a temple or some utopian temple, but that the creator of the decorative scheme on the stone had in mind the temple of their time, which was still standing. One of the short sides of the stone clearly depicts a 7-branch menorah with a tripodal base flanked on each side by a large amphora. The menorah seems to be standing on a square platform, although we believe that the artist's intent was not to portray the menorah as standing on it, a depiction unknown elsewhere, but rather as standing behind it. We believe that the square platform is a schematic depiction of the sacrificial altar that stood in the temple enclosure. Unlike the frontal view of the menorah, the square platform is shown from above, displaying its 2 main features, its square shape and the 4 horns in its corner, as described by Josephus in War 5, 225. Of the pair of amphorae depicted on the stone, it is possible that one held oil for lighting and the other contained water for the sacrifices and the laver that stood near the sacrificial altar. Above the ritual vessels is an arch entranceway resting upon 2 massive columns carved in the corners of the stones. We assume this is to be a representation of the facade of the temple's ulam, hall, as described by Josephus. The first outer gate was 70 cubits high and 25 broad and had no doors. We identify the schematic portrayal near the carved menorah on the upper side of the Magdala stone as the 2 ends of the showbread table. This assumption is based upon the manner in which the showbread table is depicted on the coins of Mattathias Antigonos and its depiction on an engraving from the upper city of Jerusalem. We believe that the 2 squares depicted above the edge of the table on the Magdala stone exhibit its 2 elevated narrow sides. Behind the showbread table is a 6-petaled rosette surrounded by 6 additional petals and flanked on each side by a pair of columns with palmetto capitals. We maintain that this depiction represents the curtain that separated the Eichal from the Holy of Holies. The long sides of the stone depict architectural elements, including a step foundation stone, stereobat, and a double voluted arcade. We believe that the Magdala stone does not depict the Temple Mount enclosure, but rather the enclosure surrounding the temple itself. The series of arches, therefore, was intended to indicate the gate around the identity of the object hanging in the center of the easternmost arch in each of the long sides of the stone remains unclear. However, the most convincing possibility is that it is an oil lamp. Mishnah Midot 1:9 states that the passageway, Mesibah, that led from the temple beneath the rampart, Birah, had lamps lit on both sides. The depiction on the back of the stone is the most surprising one. We believe that the pair of wheels on the upper part of the relief was meant to represent the lower part of a chariot, and the pattern at the bottom, flames of fire. Early Jewish description of a heavenly throne commonly depicted as being fiery. This was the way in which the artist conceived the seat of God, which marked the Holy of Holies. The depiction on the Magdala stone was informed by visions of the chariot described in the biblical and apocryphal text. Notably, however, that is not where the matter ends. The portrayal of the flames and the lower part of the chariot demonstrate great daring. What one perceives in one's mind's eye is one thing, but its visual representation in material form is something else entirely. Moreover, while the visions of the chariot mentioned in the Bible are the spiritual property of a chosen few, at Magdala, the entire congregation would have viewed its rendition in stone. As clear from the preceding discussion, the Magdala depiction prompts many questions. One group of questions concerns sacralization. Did the stone indicate a change in the sanctity of the Galilean synagogue prior to the destruction of the Second Temple? Was the presentation of the temple at the center of the synagogue intended to boost the authority of the synagogue in that it is symbolically became a sort of temple space? Was this sacralization directed at the community that assembled in the building or at the building itself? These questions also arises from the multivalence of the Greek term synagoge, which can refer to the community that assembles and to the assembly building itself. A second group of questions related to the first concerns the placement of the temple model. Does one wonders if the temple-related symbolism introduced into the synagogue was intended to heighten the value of the ritual or ceremony that took place in this synagogue, and if the space of the synagogue was perceived as sanctified on account of the activity that took place in it? Conversely, was the placement of a model of the temple at the center of the synagogue meant to boost the authority of the temple in Jerusalem rather than to load the synagogue building with a temple-like aura? Yet, a third possibility is that the placement of a temple model at the center of the synagogue was intended to combine affinity to the temple in Jerusalem with a profession of the divine presence among the community of believers. A set of questions arises when we try to correlate an architectural archaeological artifact like the Magdala stone with the ambiguous information retrieved from text on the attitude of various groups towards the temple. Does the stone signify some sort of common Judaism, or did the depiction of the temple help the community differentiate itself from other communities? Is it possible to demonstrate decisively that a particular religious stance is reflected in an archaeological object such as the Magdala stone? Alternatively, should the Magdala stone be seen as an open text, inviting the viewer into a dialogue? As is well known, the interpretation of the significance of an artifact depends to a large extent on the observer perspective. There is a range of interpretive possibilities. Due to time limitation, I will not discuss that and just comment very briefly. At Magdala, the community borrows the temple as a metaphor to heighten the significance of the activity taking place in the synagogue. The synagogue did not compete in sanctity and glory with the temple in Jerusalem. Rather, the borrowing of the temple imagery was an attempt to channel the sanctity of the temple into an activity that did not involve the offering of sacrifices. From this perspective, the Magdala stone is a forerunner of the temple iconography that we find in synagogues postdating the destruction of the temple. This iconography was intended to transfer a degree of the temple's sanctity to the synagogue without obscuring the differences between the two institutions. In this way, the synagogue could accommodate two opposing religious perceptions, which we recall Smith termed central locative, emphasizing the existing of a single physical site in which there is the divine presence, and utopian peripheral, according to which God is present everywhere. But the possibility that this interpretation was not adopted by all and that there were people who perceived the community as the temple should not be ruled out. Now I move to the last section of my talk, the practical function of the decorated stone. In the next 5 minutes, as Daniella marked, I would like to discuss the practical function of the decorated stone at Magdala. I will open with the comment that the full significance of an item of liturgical furniture or a liturgical vessel is realized when the ritual is performed. The inscription of Theodotos ben Vetenos, dated to the 1st century and unearthed in the area of the Ophel in Jerusalem, mentioned that the synagogue was designed for the reading of the Torah and the teaching of the commandments. Philo, Josephus, and the New Testament also related the custom of gathering during the Sabbath for the reading of the Torah of Moses. Thus, we read in Acts of the Apostles, Moses, after all, has never lacked spokesmen in every town for generations past. He is read in the synagogues, Sabbath by Sabbath. We came to the conclusion that a decorated stone served as part of the ritual of reading the Holy Scriptures that took place at the center of the hall. However, in contrast to other suggestions, We do not think that the Magdala stone served as a table or a lectern on which the scroll was placed. The height of the decorated stone from Magdala is 40 centimeters, and from this it follows that it rose to the height of the knees of an adult man of average height. It is too low for reading while standing, and it is inconvenient for reading by someone who is seated. The possibility, this is the reconstruction that we don't accept. The possibility we proposed was that the wooden portable chest, in Hebrew teva, that contained the Torah scroll during reading sessions was placed on the decorated stone. It was in the shape of a kibotos, a box equipped with an hinged lid that could be raised. The size of the chest was evidently in accordance with that of the scrolls. The placement of the those are Greek red figure vases, and this is a mosaic from dated to the 1st century from Rome, and it depicts the Acropolis of Athens and Socrates sitting with his students, and here you can see the kibotos with the scrolls, and here another tiny kibotos. The placement of the chest on the stone served two purposes. In this way, the lid of the chest on which the scroll was placed for reading was at a height suitable for a standing person. 2, the chest, whose holiness was inferior only to that of a Torah scroll, was giving appropriate reverence and not placed directly on top of the floor. The teva is mentioned as one of the ritual objects in the Mishnah that is close in time to the Magdala synagogue. Although the iconography of the Magdala stone is exceptional, the stone's liturgical function was not an oddity of the Magdala community, but rather an expression of a broader phenomenon in synagogue of the early and late Roman periods. Similar stones, although not identical, were discovered at Churvat Kur, Churvat Kanaf, Dir Aziz, and the fragment was found at Wadi Hammam. The upper face of the stones from Churvat Kanaf and Dir Aziz sports two carved concentric squares frame with a shallow groove between them. We propose that those frames were used to grip the wooden chest that contained the Holy Scripture. The rectangular recesses on the upper part of the stone from Churvat Kur had the same practical purpose, namely to hold the chest in place. Two shallow channels appear on the upper surface of an ashlar stone discovered near the center of the western hall in the synagogue of Magdala, and the purpose of that western hall was to serve as a study room. Archaeological finds enable more exact reading of New Testament and halachic texts that deal with ancient synagogues furniture. The most significant text that elucidate the Magdala stone and its parallels is Matthew 23, 1-6. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore, do whatever they teach you and follow it, but do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they teach. They love to have the place of honor at banquets and the best seats in the synagogue." We maintain that scholarly literature largely seems to have overlooked that this text refers to two complementary different kinds of seat. Moses' cathedra on the one hand, and the best seats in the synagogue on the other. The text did not intend any parallelism between the two types. The earlier segment relates to a single seat associated with Moses and the authority for teaching the law, while the last segment of the Gospels passage refers to the privileged seats of the heads of the synagogue community. As to the first type, from various expressions in late Second Temple text, we learn that the term Moses and Torah were sometimes used interchangeably. Hence, we follow the suggestion of Ginsburger, Cecil Roth, and Levi Yitzhak Rahmani that the cathedra of Moses was a throne for the Torah scroll. Nevertheless, we disagree that the stone seats that were known to these scholars from Delos, Korazim, and Sluch excavation at Hamat Tiberias are the cathedra of Moses. In our view, the distinction made in Matthew 23 between the two types of seats explain this similarity in the shape and location inside the synagogue hall of special stone seats that were discovered in various sites. The Magdala stone, the decorated stone from Chovat Kur, and the stones from Chovat Kanaf and Dir Aziz comprise one group. The Delos, Korazim, Hamat Tiberias, and the undecorated stone seat from Chovat Kur belong to the different group. These two groups of chairs differ with respect to shape and location. The chairs in the first group were located at the center of the hall and were carved from all sides, while the second was integrated into one of the benches. The confusion between the stemmed mainly from the double use of the word cathedra, once as a term indicating the chair of a distinguished person, and once as a resting place of the Torah. And you can see, and this is the last slide, you can see here a study room from the site of Comedique in Alexandria, dated to late antiquity. And you can see here a special seat that was preserved for the teacher. And you can see here at the center of the hall, another small platform that probably intended to be the seat of the kibbutos that contained the scrolls for teaching. Thank you.
It is a poignant moment for me to sit here today and honor Cana on the occasion of her retirement. It is sad because to honor a colleague on her retirement means to realize that we become old. Well, perhaps not all of us, perhaps Cana herself remains young, but for me, it is quite clear that I am becoming older and older. Time never stops. And we are at a point in our lives that we tend to reminisce about past events, those dear moments when we were still young and we had future. One such occasion was the inauguration of the Deichmann program here at Ben-Gurion University. Cana invited me then, Cana invited the late Professor Larry Hurtado to give a series of lectures on that occasion. And because she knew that I'm interested in early Christianity, and out of friendship, she invited me to attend the event, which was highly successful and most enjoyable. So as a little token of gratitude for that past invitation of, I think, 22 years ago or so, though a belated one, I am standing here today hoping that my lecture will pay my debt.
You paid for your hotel.
The Greek word pistis and the related verb pistewein, commonly translated in New Testament studies as faith or belief and to believe, respectively, are central to Christian religious thinking. They are found in numerous places in the New Testament in general and play a pivotal role in Paul's writings. Not only their frequency in Paul's letters testifies to their centrality, but their appearance in key verses where Paul presents his gospel and mission indicates that for Paul, pistis stands at the heart of his religious project. Thus, in the very opening section of his epistle to the Romans, Paul describes himself as, quote, a servant of Jesus Christ through whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith. And then he addresses his audience mentioning their faith, his hope that we may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith. And then he emphasizes that I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation for everyone who has faith, for in it, quote, is the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith, as it is written, he who through faith is righteous shall live, unquote. It is not a coincidence that in his very first letter to the Thessalonians, he designates the early Christians as hoi pisteuantes, the believers. For pistis is indeed the heart of the religiosity he proclaims. Pistis, moreover, is the concept through which Paul presents his gospel vis-a-vis nomos, the law, and more specifically, erga nomu, works of the law. Maasei Torah, the Hebrew equivalent, is found in 4Q MMT. That is the fulfillment of the commandments, which as a former Pharisee, he knew very well, stands at the heart of Judaism. We ourselves, he writes furiously in Galatians 2:15-16, who are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners, know that a man is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. And this message is reiterated in following verses time and again. The Galatians, Paul maintains, did not receive the Spirit by works of the law, but, quote, by hearing with faith. And rhetorically, he asks them, does he who supplies the Spirit to you, who works miracles among you, do so by works of the law or by hearing with faith? Thus, making it clear not only that faith is the true basis for the religious experience of the Christian, but also, and not less important, that it stands in contrast to works of the law, the fulfillment of the commandments. Following the standard translations, conventional wisdom understands pistis in all these and many other verses as faith, belief. As a result, Paul's contrast of pistis to nomos is usually understood as presenting two competing ways to salvation: the law, the Torah, which is futile on the one hand, and belief in Christ, which is true and effective on the other hand. One must avoid, Paul emphasizes, the trap of thinking that by fulfilling the commandments, one is saved. Rather, one should believe in Christ in order to achieve that goal. According to this formulation, believing in Christ is, in a sense, a kind of deed, a different type of deed to be sure, but a deed nonetheless, an act, so to speak, of the individual that leads him or her to salvation. I do not think that I will be running the risk of being ridiculed if I claim that this is the way Paul is understood by most Jewish students of ancient Judaism. Recent decades have witnessed, however, a dramatic shift among New Testament scholars with respect to the proper way Paul's use of pistis, and especially his theological construct, pistis Christou Jesu, or according to other text witnesses, pistis Jesu Christou, should be understood. In Galatians 2:16, Paul repeatedly emphasizes that, quote, a man is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. And this is traditionally understood as a contrast between doing, that is, of the law, the Torah, and believing, that is, believing in Jesus Christ. However, since the publication of Richard Hayes's book, The Belief of Jesus Christ, 40 years ago in 1985, scholars have come to recognize that the genitive construct pistis Jesu Christou, or pistis Christou Jesu, may be taken either as objective genitive and consequently rendered belief in Jesus Christ, as it is indeed traditionally translated, or subjective genitive, which should be accordingly translated the belief of Jesus Christ. And this latter translation has far-reaching implications for our understanding of Paul's thought. For if pistis Jesu Christou is not belief in Jesus Christ, but rather the belief of Jesus Christ, the traditional contrast between doing and believing can no longer be maintained. To be sure, Hayes was not the first to argue in favor of reading pistis Jesu Christou as subjective genitive, that is, the pistis of Jesus Christ. In fact, this translation can be found already in the old King James Version. However, Hayes's detailed study can be seen as a turning point indeed. From that point on, scholars no longer allow themselves to assume without careful consideration that Paul's theology rests on a distinction between one's deeds and one's belief. Rather, the distinction seems to be between one's deeds, which do not grant justification before God and do not lead to salvation, and God's gracious gift of salvation, be it precise mechanic as it may. As Stanley Stowers has dramatically written in his 1991, a rereading of Romans, and I quote, "Rare are the occasions when the weight of scholarly argument on a subject shifts decisively and probatively. But recently, such a shift has taken place in the understanding of the word pistis in Paul's letters. In particular, the evidence and arguments for reading pistis Jesu as the faith or faithfulness of Jesus rather than faith in Jesus have proven decisive. Admittedly, later scholarly discussions have shown that the evidence is less decisive than Stowers wished us to think. However, it is agreed by virtually all scholars today that the traditional rendering of pistis as belief and the ensuing understanding of Paul as demanding belief in Jesus is not as simple as it used to be assumed. In addition to the various grammatical considerations raised by scholars, it is not simple because of two crucial passages in Paul's own letters, from which it seems quite clear that Paul, when speaking of pistis, had a divine power in his mind, not the individual's stance. In Romans 3:20-24, a passage that appears to be Paul's own elaboration of his statement in Galatians 2:16, Paul says, and I quote, "For no human being will be justified in God's sight by works of the law," precisely as he says in Galatians, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law. The righteousness of God through pisteos Jesu Christou for all who believe. The close connection between these verses and Paul's insistence in Galatians 2:16 that one is not justified before God by means of works of the law, but only through pistis Jesu Christou, is evident. In addition, the beginning of verse 19, oidamen de hoti, is a verbatim repetition of the very first words of the verse in Galatians. And this too indicates that the passage in Romans is indeed Paul's interpretation of his own statement in his earlier letter. However, while in Galatians 2:16, Paul contrasts works of the law with pistis Jesu Christou, here in Romans, he contrasts works of the law with the righteousness of God. Hence, pistis Jesu Christou cannot be understood as the individual's belief, that is, his or her belief in Jesus Christ, because it refers to God's own righteousness, and it appears to describe God's action, not the stance of the individual. This understanding is corroborated by Galatians 3:23-24, where Paul refers to pistis as something that happened. And I quote, "Before pistis came, we were confined under the law, kept under restraint until pistis should be revealed," so that the law was our custodian until Christ came. If pistis is something that came and is revealed, then it cannot be in the individual's own state of believing. Rather, it is something external, something objective, something that arrived. On a second reading, moreover, one can easily see the parallel between the two parts of the sentence. That is, between we were confined under the law, kept under restraint until pistis should be revealed, and the law was our custodian until Christ came. This parallelism suggests that pistis and Christ are, in a sense, one and the same, so that pistis Jesu Christou should be understood as the pistis, which is Jesus Christ. I'm willing even to go a step farther, together with Ernst Lohmeyer in his Grundlagen Paulinische Theologie, published back in 1929, and to suggest the possibility of understanding that phrase as a shorthand for God's pistis, revealed through his sending of Jesus Christ. And it would not be out of place to note in this context that God is referred to as pistos, ne'eman in Hebrew, in various places in the Hebrew Bible. At any event, pistis Jesu Christou cannot be understood as the belief in Jesus Christ, that is the individual's belief, his or her assent to a proposition, such as that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah. This recognition has gained broad acceptance since the publication of Teresa Morgan's 2015 book, Roman Faith and Christian Faith, Pistis and Fides in the Early Roman Empire and Early Churches. In that remarkable book, Professor Morgan has decisively demonstrated not only that pistis has a variety of meaning in Greek, far more than the widespread understanding of faith and belief allows for, but more importantly, that pistis does not usually carry the meaning of belief. It does not refer to an affirmation of a proposition that one embraces about the world or about God. Rather, it is a relational term. It refers to one's attitude toward others, and therefore it is better understood either as trust or confidence, from which a state of steadfastness and loyalty may be derived. Ho pistos, accordingly, should not be translated as the believer, but rather he who is trustworthy because he is loyal. To appreciate the significance of these claims, let us briefly consider their presentation by Lindsay Dridger Murphy in her review of Morgan's book. In her superb book, Dridger Murphy writes, Professor Morgan provides a new understanding of what faith meant to pagans, Jews, and Christians in the early Roman Empire. This formulation is an excellent example of how scholars fall into the trap of thinking about ancient types of religiosity through Christian lenses, that is, Christianizing the ancient evidence. For Morgan's book is not dedicated to the question what faith meant for pagans, for Jews, and Christians, as Dridger Murphy writes, but rather to showing that a major concept used by the ancients, pistis in Greek, fides in Latin, which is frequently understood as faith, should not be understood that way in the first place. Dridger Murphy's formulation presupposes the prevalent Christian understanding, which centers on the individual's stance of belief. And she paints Morgan's project accordingly as an attempt at clarifying what faith meant for pagans, for Jews, and for Christians. But the main thrust of Morgan's book is precisely to problematize this very assumption and to show that the concept of pistis hardly refers to one's belief. It does not consist of intellectual assent to propositions, not at any event in the first century, in Christianity's very first stages, as seen in Paul's letters. How then are we to understand Paul's claim in Galatians 2:16 that having realized that one is not justified before God by means of works of the law, only through pistis Jesu Christou, we therefore episteuesamen in Christ Jesus? Does not the verb episteuesamen refer to one's belief, as nearly all modern translations of the New Testament render it? Is not Moises Silva correct in claiming that, quote, even if we should decide that pistis Jesu Christou refers to Christ's own faithfulness, one can hardly deny that the individual believing response play a central role in this statement? Isn't Silva correct? Silva's tone and self-confidence notwithstanding, the answer, I believe, should be negative. Despite the temptation to accept his argument, we should bear in mind, as Richard Hayes, Stanley Stowers, Sam Williams, and many others have observed, that nowhere is there any statement in Paul's letters which unambiguously presents Christ as an object of faith. Faith is never directed towards Christ. It is always directed towards God and only towards God. It is extremely difficult, therefore, to understand Paul in Galatians 2:16 as claiming that we have believed in Christ Jesus. Indeed, once we realize, following Morgan, that pistis does not refer to one's embracing of a proposition, and that it is better understood as a relational stance of trust and loyalty, we may be able to offer an alternative understanding of Paul's claim. As I have suggested above, the phrase pistis Jesu Christou shouldn't be understood as referring to Jesus's pistis, but rather as referring to God's pistis, in that he sent the Christos, the Messiah. Accordingly, I suggest, Paul says that because both he and Peter know that one is not justified by means of works of the law, but only through God's saving action, that is by sending the Christos, the Messiah named Jesus, therefore we trusted that divine action and we remained loyal to God and his promise in order to be saved. The Christian on this reading is characterized by his or her trust in God and by a loyalty to God's promise of salvation. In this respect, Paul's use of the cultural coin pistis is not very much different than the way other first century Jews used it. As recently shown by Jennifer Ale, in the first century CE, there was a substantial rise in the frequency with which Greek-speaking authors discussed pistis, which was understood as fidelity, trust, or better, trustworthiness. However, as Ale goes on to note, therefore suggests that Judeans view fidelity as a national lasting characteristic from the patriarchs to their own day, and that their emphasis on pistis, fidelity, should be understood within the context of living under the colonizing power of Rome, a principle that was equally preoccupied with fidelity. Pistis, for Second Temple period Jews, in other words, was a virtue related to loyalty and faithfulness. Accordingly, ho pistos was a designation of a person who, because having pistis, could be relied upon. The Hebrew equivalent is ne'eman, which is found in numerous places in the Hebrew Bible and in Qumran and in Mishnaic Hebrew. Its antonym is boged, that is a traitor, a renegade, and its use in the Dead Sea Scrolls is illuminating. The Qumran texts are replete with expressions such as adat bogdim, designating the sect's opponents, who are considered as traitors who abandon the truth and follow their deceiving leader. The Qumranites, in contrast, although viewing themselves as a group that intentionally withdrew from the rest of the people, emphasized their fidelity. As the author of 4QMT writes at the conclusion of the letter, and I quote, "And you know that we have separated ourselves from the multitude of the people and from all their impurity and from being involved with these matters and from participating with them in these things. Yet you know that no treachery or deceit or evil can be found in our hands. And since for these things we give our souls." As noted by Menachem Kiste, the words ma'al and sheker, translated by Qumran and Strugnell as treachery and deceit, may be understood as bearing social, political stance. And consequently, the author's statement that no treachery or deceit or evil can be found among us should be understood as a defensive claim, the heart of which is that he and his group should not be considered traitors, for they are reliable and sincere. If we were to express this claim using Greek parlance, we would probably say we are pistoi, that is, we are loyal and reliable. In Mishnaic Hebrew, we find that the Greek word pistis comes alongside the Hebrew word amana. Thus, for example, the Tosefta Ketubot 9.2 refers to shtar amana v'shtar pistis, a rite of amana and a rite of pistis. But as noted by Sol Lieberman, the vav is actually vav explicativum. That is, the latter expression is equivalent of the former and functions as its translation. This philological explanation enables us to consider an early rabbinic midrash found in the Mechilta de Rebbe Ishmael, with which I would like to conclude my talk. So the Mechilta runs as follows. The trust, the Mechilta attempts to answer the question, what was the merit of the Israelites for which they deserved God's salvific power in splitting the Red Sea for them. And the Mechilta says as follows: the trust which they trusted me, ha'amana she'eminu bi, is deserving that I should divide the sea for them. For they did not say to Moses, how can we go out into the desert without having provisions for the journey? Rather, they trusted Moses and followed him. And of them it is stated in the book of Jeremiah, go and proclaim in the hearing of Jerusalem, thus says the Lord, I remember the devotion of your youth, your love as a bride, how you followed me in the wilderness, in a land that was not sown. What reward did they receive for this? Israel is holy to the Lord. Trusting God's promise against all odds indicates Israel's loyalty to their Father in heaven. And this is the meaning of amana, which is the rabbinic equivalent of pistis. Israel's redemption is predicated on their faithfulness to God, despite what might seem to be their desertion, as indicated by the social and political reality of the homilists' days. The emphasis on faithfulness to God as the required religious disposition that secures redemption, as seen in the Midrash, places, in fact, the ancient rabbis in close proximity to Paul, not in opposition to him, not in polemic against him, but rather in close proximity to his religious sensitivity. The major difference being that for Paul, salvation has already arrived, while for the ancient rabbis, it was an event that they were still hoping for. For the sages, the essence of the messianic idea, to quote the late Professor Shaya Leibovich of blessed memory, is that the Messiah forever will come. HaMashiach leolam yavo. Thank you very much.
And also Roland's comments about Jesus' family. I never thought about Tzranim as part of Netzer, which is a good solution, because till now we didn't know what it is and where it was illuminating talk, Rina, which I saw already, and that's why I wanted to bring you here, because the only one who heard you, and now the whole crowd knows this is a very important finding. So thank you very much. Just to share a few thoughts. First of all, about destroyer. I am still a destroyer, Roland, because my paper, which I'm writing right now, the role of the Hasmonean in the war against Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV, and according to my interpretation, they were not alone. There was another more important group beside them, and the fact that the temple was purified was not a consequence of a war, but a consequence of a negotiation between Lysias, who was a representative of Antiochus here, and the other group. So at some point they decided to withdraw to Qumran. So the Qumranites are the group which was the partners of the Hasmonean. It's very complicated. That I have to write a paper about it, and I'm the first destroyer of this whole scene. But I compare first Maccabee to second Maccabees, and can show that there is another group there behind the scene, which was hidden later by the Hasmonean, who won the war in terms of the political struggle at 152 BCE. So I'm continuing my way of research, the destructive. And also another point, that I just finished a paper about the expectation, messianic expectation in the priestly circle. And for them, it was clear that the Davidic Messiah will never appear. He finished his task in this world, and the next Messiah will be from a priestly family. So this is a paper which is going to be published, and I will be happy to to send it to you when it will be out there in a book, which is the result of a conference in Lublin in Poland a year and a half ago. Now, I just wanted to mention that this is my last point. I started actually my work after finishing my PhD about halacha, the development of halacha. And the first book I published was the question of the development of halacha in light of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I collaborated with Aaron Shemesh, Zal, who passed away about 8 years ago, and we published a book about it. And this was actually the foundation of dealing with Jubilees, which has both apocalyptic expectations and rewritten Bible, but also there is halakha there, and it is important part of the book. So I am thankful to Aaron Shemesh, who was willing to work with me, and we published the book 14 years ago, and it's still, somehow it's still read by people. And the last thing, I think Adi's talk reminded me Larry Hurtado, who was dealing with the question of the relationship between Jesus and God. And you showed us that they cooperated, but but as the last point was that you have to trust God, to develop a good relationship with Him and trust Him and have emun in Him, and He will have emun in you. That's why He sent His Messiah, Jesus. And it's a very nice way to close a circle we started in the Deichmann lecture of 2004, and it was really successful. And that's why Deichmann decided to keep the program alive and to give me the opportunity to be part of the Ben-Gurion University. So I'm very thankful for the chance I got from the Deichmann generosity, because of the Deichmann generosity, and I am very thankful for Ben-Gurion University who accepted me. And I am very thankful to all my colleagues around this table and elsewhere who was willing to cooperate with me and to appoint me as a chair of the department for 3 years. And I hope to keep working and keep coming for conferences and keep talking and communicating about research, about life. Hopefully I will not, I won't be forced to be out on other street and meet Rina there demonstrating against the current government. And we'll have peace and prosperity with a good democratic government in a Jewish liberal democratic state. Thank you very, very much.